morning, everyone. Thank you for getting up and being here early. We have a terrific panel to talk about the most pressing security issues that confront not just the United States, but our allies and countries around the world. So starting from stage right, Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, Ambassador Tom Pickering, who is among the most decorated career diplomats and former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and David Sanger of the New York Times, the national security journalist and best-selling author. His book is out front for you to get. Before we start, we wanted to ask a question. This is a sort of a Kent Presents thing where you get to tell us what you think. And so you all should have gotten your little devices. The question, you'll see it on the screen: should enhanced interrogation techniques be permitted when dealing with suspected terrorists? You'll have 10 seconds to vote. 1 is yes, 2 is no, and 3 is uncertain. I'll tell you while you're voting that we will ask the question again at the end of the session and then put up the results of before and after. Okay, so let me sort of set the stage before I begin the conversation. You know, over the last several months, we've seen a wave of attacks across Europe and beyond. It started with Paris and Brussels. We've seen more recently Nice and Istanbul, Bangladesh. We've seen sort of the morphing of what we traditionally considered the al-Qaeda threat, the extremist Sunni Islamic threat. You know, al-Qaeda talked about the notional establishment of a caliphate. ISIS has done it. Al-Qaeda used the internet as a means of communication among operatives, and we've seen ISIS use it as a recruiting tool and a propaganda distribution outlet using social media. Just yesterday, Twitter announced the closing of another 235,000 accounts in addition to what they had done. But social media has been very slow to react to the fact that they were using it. A nonprofit that I chair, the Counter-Extremism Project, pushed very hard and warned the social media companies that to allow these accounts to go unchallenged was providing material support. You might imagine the lawyers at the social media companies were very nervous about this. It took them some time to react, but they've begun to react now. Unfortunately, people on social media, including children, have seen things like beheading videos in the interim before they began to take down those accounts. This will continue to be a struggle, an everyday struggle, but the internet has become a battlefield. Just like we think of the physical space, the internet now with ISIS has become a battlefield. So I'd like to start the question, Sir Richard, why don't you talk to us about the current threat environment and how you see it? Is it getting worse, better? How do you assess, and what do you think are the biggest threats?
Well, I'm a great believer in proportionality, which means not sort of exaggerating the problem beyond its bounds, and it's very easy when you're talking about terrorism to be extreme, you know, in our assessment of the problem. But I mean, there's no question at the moment that the terrorist threat is serious and isn't, as it were, in reduction. I think the problem that we're facing is that ISIS probably are close to being militarily defeated now. And they're on the back foot and losing territory. But I think that the ideological problem, the radicalization problem of young Muslims in particular, is serious and probably getting worse. And I think that the consequence of ISIS's defeat in terms of the impact on Europe is that there will probably be a distribution of returnees with military and terrorist experience into a number of European countries, and that therefore will heighten the immediate threat on the streets. We also have to remember, you know, Al-Qaeda is still out there. Al-Qaeda has survived to an extent by embedding its leadership in the al-Nusra Front in Syria. and also has distributed its influence through franchise in a way, so that you have Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Boko Haram, and other movements which look principally towards Al-Qaeda. I mean, it's not a clear-cut line. And I think that what we have to remember is that terrorist movements, to have credibility, have to commit acts of terrorism. They can't sort of continue to exist in theory and not do stuff. And there is no question that I think that there is almost a struggle for influence pending between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, particularly as ISIS is knocked off its back foot militarily. So the threat is by no means diminished, and the outlook, I wouldn't call it bleak, but the outlook is worrying and serious. And I think it's greater in Muslim countries, ironically, where Al-Qaeda has been more active and even ISIS has been more active. But obviously we have a problem which has been seen clearly in Belgium and in France. I would personally sort of preach a little bit of caution in terms of extrapolating in too much detail from the French example. The French have a French problem, which is a very large Muslim community of over 5 million, the largest in Europe, which is not well integrated and absorbed into French society. And there is a sort of double problem. There is the influence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in France, but there is also the dispossession of young Muslims, which you see very clearly in French cities like Paris and Marseille in particular, where there are Muslim ghettos which are effectively no-go areas. Now, the French security service, I mean, just briefly, are very strong and very good. And I feel extremely sorry for my colleagues in the French security service for not having prevented the recent attacks in France. But the problem has really been that the Belgian security service is very poor, and most of these attacks have been mounted out of Brussels. And I mean, I won't go into the detail, but speaking bluntly, the Belgian security service is one of the least efficient and poorest performing in Europe, despite the help that services like the UK try to give them. And this is to do with the division between French and Flemish-speaking groups in Belgium, and the fact that these divisions are reflected in their security service. In fact, not to put too fine a point on it, they're useless. Which is a really serious business, because they've been very complacent about the problems in Brussels, which have been known about for a long time, and rather too late they've woken up to the problem. So in sum, I mean, I think that's where we stand, and there is a huge problem still with the radicalization of Muslim youth, I think throughout many European countries, certainly in the UK. Mainly, you're looking at young men between the ages of 18 and 32. I mean, there is a sort of profile which you can trace, and it doesn't take many of these people being radicalized and then being trained as terrorists to cause mayhem, in the open societies in which we live. So I'm not pessimistic, because we're much better at dealing with the problem, despite the Belgian security service, than we used to be. But on the other hand, it's sort of the indices is not going down, right? And I think this is what's worrying.
Okay, so we know that Sir Richard is not the diplomat. Let us turn to the diplomat.
No, I'm not. I wouldn't have said that about the Belgians were happy.
Tom, tell us, in this context, Sir Richard talked about the bleed out of foreign fighters, the threat when they're coming into and through countries with not particularly competent services. What is the diplomatic strategy to try and deal with sort of the problem, the bleed out problem, and preventing it from coming from Western Europe into the United States?
Well, I think that I agree with what Sir Richard has said. We have to keep this in proportion. To some extent, the tendency is always to treat these problems as existential, but it's hard to make that case. But it is serious, and we all have politics. And when political leaders suffer attacks, obviously the sense is that the response has to be kind of overwhelmingly reassuring to the public. And the movement of peoples, which Sir Richard described and which you asked about, I think is a significant problem. The good news is for the United States that we don't take refugees essentially from that part of the world without a 2-year examination. I think that's the kind of timeline at the moment. My own view is that that may be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that we all have to find a way to look carefully at the people who are coming. A lot of that depends upon the skills, the techniques, the information, and the way in which our intelligence services work and how they can provide the information into the admission process, whatever that is. The borderline is the borderline in terms of moving. Europe has a particular problem because of the Schengen system and not just weak services, but sometimes weak borders. We have a problem in some ways that has been seen to be Canada and Mexico, but it's not a wall. The answer is obviously to be smarter, to be more capable. I think the first line of defense is always in these kinds of cases intelligence, but not everything always works through intelligence. The second line of defense is obviously some careful look at the people coming in. I won't say, what is it, the word that the candidate used, something like extreme vetting, yeah, like extreme unction. But my sense is that we need to do better. I think cooperation is a critically important function in diplomacy, or intelligence diplomacy, and Sir Richard will know what that means, is in my view a very important part. How our services connect, how they talk to each other, and how they talk to the rest of the government, and how that get put together. It's a whole of government problem, and the diplomacy piece is a way of making the connections that are sometimes vital and sometimes significant in putting that together. And my feeling is that those are the front lines of defense that at some point, to make those better, sometimes we have to involve heads of state. And that's extremely useful. It is fascinating and interesting that we find countries with whom we have even what I would call dyspeptic dispositions, like Russia and China, themselves are very worried about this issue. And one can find isolated but significant areas, maybe islands of cooperation, that are sometimes very useful in moving that question ahead. Just one final point. The Islamic Caliphate was seen as essentially a territorialization of extremist radical Muslim behavior. But we seem to have missed for a while that a year and a half ago, maybe in anticipation of the fact that they were not entirely sure that they could maintain the sanctity of their territory, they did what Al-Qaeda had done. They jumped over borders and franchised widely. So we have, in addition, I think, to Al-Qaeda franchising, at least some operation of the Islamic State in that regard. You have organizations like Boko Haram, who I think were looking for support, finding a way to provide allegiance to them in their efforts. And the second piece was trying to go for the soft spots. And Belgium and France, but we had some other areas that showed up as soft spots to conduct the terrorist acts that obviously give them their name and their influence. We, knock on wood, and I hope this is not plastic, have been remarkably lucky, even though we have been afflicted. And we need, obviously, to continue to watch that as carefully as we can. We'll get to this in a minute, but diplomacy, in my view, is not radical measures. It is not eliminating entire parts of your population, deporting large numbers of people, erecting walls, doing everything on the basis of racial profiling or ethnic profiling, which in itself can lead you down false traces and spend a lot of your time and effort. And as you said in your opening remarks, Fran, begin to create yourself a recruiting tool on the other side. We need to watch all of those kinds of questions very carefully.
You know, Tom, you raise a good point about sometimes foreign fighters, in the political rhetoric of the United States, foreign fighters and refugees have somehow become synonymous. And there's precious little factual evidence of that, frankly. Is it a possible threat? Yes. Could they use the refugee pipeline, a terrorist?
Sure.
Certainly. But correct me if I'm wrong, in the last 30 years, there's been only a single case of a foreign fighter from Iraq who came into the United States using the refugee process. And after that, the Obama administration relooked at the vetting process. It now takes 2 years. And so there's only one case in 30 years that I can recall of them actually using that. And so
That may be. We had the Algerian in Port Angeles who came in on the ferry boat with explosives, but not a lot. But the foreign element has some recruiting potentiality, but so does the internet. And so do people who are domestic and discontent. And as we see, obviously, in this election campaign, discontent in the United States is not limited to Muslims. The third point, I think, is this is not a war against Muslims. And there are people who would, for reasons of their own, turn it into it. I thought that George W. Bush, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, tried hard to make that point. There were people around him who I think were less convinced that he was right. He was right, and in many ways, that has become the kind of spear point of the recruiting process that you talked about, whether it is, terrible pictures on the internet to reinforce it. And we need to be very careful in this country about turning everybody of a particular group or religion into an enemy, or even to be sensitive to the fact that their vulnerabilities to recruitment have to be very carefully examined. And I think very carefully looked at without building this momentum against ourselves from people who are otherwise economically, socially, maybe educationally not included in what is clearly the American future.
David, you've been covering these issues across multiple administrations. What happens if there is an attack inside the United States in this political period? What is the likely reaction of the candidates, of the country, and what's the impact of it on the election?
Well, it's a great question, Fran, because I think the answer we would have given a few months ago might be different than the answer today. Let me get to that by just picking up on one thing that Sir Richard said and that Tom said. If you think about the time from 9/11 forward, the 13 years since, we've learned a lot over that time about how to go deal with these issues. And you were sitting there at the critical moments when we were learning some of these. So as Tom pointed out, at the beginning after 9/11, President Bush went out of his way to go visit the mosque in Washington, make the point repeatedly, this is not a war against Muslims, make the point that the terrorists had, I think the phrase he used to use was, hijacked a great religion. Then, under some kind of pressure, he wandered away from that for a while. And you may remember a series of short-lived speeches he gave about Islamofascism, right? Yeah. And many of your colleagues, and you, I think, thought maybe that wasn't the best approach, right? And because what it was doing was unifying these groups rather than what you want to do, which is splinter them up and show them to be not part of the mainstream of the religion. Because the concern is that at the moment that you try to characterize an entire religion, you end up aiding the recruiters who make the point that the United States is trying to destroy the entire religion instead of going after individual terrorists. And I think President Bush ultimately got in the right place on that. And President Obama has gone further in that direction, which is why he avoids using this phrase about radical Islamic terrorism, because his view is that it isn't descriptive, but that it doesn't help you in trying to go do this. So then you go forward to the campaign. Secretary Clinton has not said very much on these topics or on any foreign policy issue in the heat of the campaign. I think her view has been that Donald Trump is doing a fine job of describing these issues themselves, and she sort of wants to let him get out there. And you saw in the speech that he gave on Monday on these issues, he was sort of veering back toward where President Bush had been in the Islamofascism time. He did not use that phrase, but he did try to describe this as a religion-wide problem. He had to back off from the idea of banning all Muslim immigration for a while, but instead has done it now regionally in a way that would make you think in the implementation that it would probably be primarily directed at Muslim immigrants. He said countries that have a terrorism problem. So I assume that we would shut down our immigration from France and Belgium. And by the way, I think that Sir Richard was kind in his description of the Belgian. I was having dinner with a senior intelligence official a couple of months ago who was pining for the great days of Hercule Poirot. He thought that we had moved back a century or so from his fine investigative skills. So then the question comes, we've got 80 some odd days till the election. What would happen if there was a significant terror attack between now and then? A few months ago, I think I would have said that it would probably have played to Mr. Trump. Today, I'm not quite so certain, because I think that his solutions have been attacked by so many within his own party. If you look at the letter of the 50 national security officials who wrote the letter 2 weeks ago saying that they could not support him, that I'm not sure that it would necessarily change the dynamic all that much. It would probably push some votes to him, but I'm not sure that it would be a highly significant number, because I think Americans have been through this now long enough to sort of recognize that there are some solutions that are workable and some that aren't. A last point on the recruitment issue. Yes, the social media companies were very slow. There's a technique that Mr. Trump argued for in his speech, which was simply pull the internet plug on all of these. Okay, first of all, we don't own the internet. Unfortunate, but that's the way life works. But the second point is, the intelligence professionals, your former colleagues, all tell you the last thing they want to do is cut off whatever ability they have to monitor those groups who they've gotten into the system with. And as soon as you pull the plug on one part, they go dark to someplace else. And my guess is if you were in your old job, that's probably not the approach you would have advocated.
Let me add to what David is saying. So this notion of restricting in some way immigration from countries that have the problem, mostly Muslim countries. Our greatest intelligence ally in the fight against Islamic extremism has been, much to people's chagrin, Saudi Arabia. Yeah. We restrict immigration from Muslim countries that have this problem, like Saudi Arabia, and you can rest assured it impacts the intelligence relationship, which has resulted in the disruption and defeat of at least 3 plots to the American homeland. And so there are very serious consequences, even to the rhetoric, in the context of a political campaign, because as I and others travel through the region, they're feeling a little uncertain about their relationship with us. So it's interesting, Sir Richard, what do you think is the likelihood that the United States sees the kinds of attacks that Europe has suffered in the next sort of 6 to 9 months?
Well, it's always dangerous to make predictions. I mean, I think the US, for all sorts of reasons, is better protected, partly because of the restriction on people getting into this country. But there is clearly a lone wolf danger here, which is significant because of your gun control or lack of gun control policy, which is not reproduced, for example, in the UK. So, I mean, I think that the risk here is that you have individuals who could be influenced, who can do crazy things, as happened, in Miami. But the extent to which that is really a terrorist attack is, it's bordering, towards a shooting incident by a mad individual, an unbalanced individual. So, but you cannot discount that danger. And obviously, if you're the Al-Qaeda leadership or the ISIS leadership, your ultimate objective is to pull something off on the US mainland because it has that much more impact. I mean, terrorism you have to bear in mind as a form of political communication. It's about sending a message. It's about sending a dramatic message. You know, having rejected other means of political messaging, you're going for extreme violence. And so the risk is definitely there. But I just wanted to say something about intelligence cooperation and the important point that Tom mentioned about a sort of network of effort against terrorism. And I mean, what's happened since 9/11 really is that those bonds between intelligence organizations are so much stronger and so much more sophisticated and so much more far-reaching. And the US plays a massively important role in sort of orchestrating and coordinating that. And it's not just about talking to friends. It's about talking to dyspeptic colleagues like the Russians and the Chinese. And also, it's important to emphasize, and Fran mentioned this, the role that Arab services play in helping us deal with the terrorist threat. I mean, for example, Jordan, massively important, the GID in Jordan. The Saudis, you know, who are difficult to deal with, but also massively important. And then the other thing you have to imagine is this extraordinary sort of relationship that's been developed between technical intelligence, SIGINT, and HUMINT, and the ability to fuse the two to create a global picture of the terrorist threat. But I mean, I have to mention this because the theme was liberty and security, that, you know, Edward Snowden did massive damage, not just to the US, but certainly to the UK's assets as well. And, you know, whatever you think about the Snowden issue, it has set back our ability to cover certain aspects of counterterrorism because of the sophistication of the sort of intercept process. And, you know, personally, maybe the political classes in the United States should have been more educated about what the capability was. But there's no question in my mind that the capability technically was legal. And certainly in the UK, this was not an issue because the political classes knew very well what the capability of our NSA equivalent was, GCHQ. And it's taken a significant amount of time, I think, for the intelligence communities who work on this problem to recover from the Snowden setback. But I mean, I'm not in the know in detail now, but I think some of that ground has been recouped. But it's definitely made things more dangerous. And if you're talking about, you know, the threat of an attack here in the US, you have to consider the Snowden factor as increasing the likelihood of an attack here.
I think it's worth mentioning, and both Sir Richard and Ambassador Pickering have alluded to it. You know, I think most people don't fully appreciate that the intelligence diplomacy, the intelligence relationships are very important because even when the political and diplomatic relationships aren't going so well, those intelligence relationships remain, and that exchange of information remains. And so whether it's during the Iraq War, where the US and French diplomats and political leaders disagreed vehemently over the American approach, the intelligence relationships not only survived but thrived, and the exchange of counterterrorism information continued unabated. And so people should take a good deal of comfort that the security relationships continue quite fulsomely despite political and diplomatic disagreements. Tom, let me ask you, you know, we, for years prior to 9/11, made a big fuss about countries that had a bad human rights record and their representations. If we were to return people, we relied on our diplomats to get those assurances from those countries, Pakistan, Egypt, there's a long list. And then came the revelation about enhanced interrogation techniques. Can you talk about the difficulty and the seeming to some of our allies around the world double standard that created? Sir Richard, I'm going to come back to you about the effectiveness of those techniques.
Yeah, you're creeping up on this 900-pound gorilla from behind. So let's face it first from the front. Enhanced interrogation techniques certainly, in my view, in the main have constituted torture, in the words of the convention, and in the words of the US law, which implements the convention. And I think there's no doubt in my mind that it's illegal. A famous American political leader whose name will not be mentioned used to say once in a while, in moments of frustration and humor, the illegal will do tomorrow, the unconstitutional will take a little while. But it's not in that category, and I think we have to be very careful. And just the recruitment tool problem is real. Sir Richard will talk about the notion of reliability, but as far as I can tell, people under this kind of extreme pressure often tell you what they believe you want to know, rather than what you need to know. And so it's highly unreliable. And why do the courts in almost all recognized countries permit none of this evidence so determined to be made available? Clearly, because of the huge question of personal rights. And so you get to your question, should we be doing at home things that we've been advocating countries abroad not to do? And the answer to me seems to be fairly simple, no. That it is in that regard extremely important to do so. And look, I know there's maybe an argument against interest here, and it has to come out on the table. There will be people who will make up the most extraordinary kind of situation where somebody knows a fact that is likely within 20 minutes to result in the nuclear explosion that destroys all of us. Those are questions that I think are wonderful for science fiction and for good novels and maybe spy stories, but hardly likely to occur in the kind of real-world situation we have to face. And so pursuing a system that involves that kind of activity, when we also know that systems of interrogation that we pursue without that kind of activity often develop the kind of friendly relations, not the friendly relations between intelligence agencies which have been battling for years over the Cold War but have a common problem with terrorism, but interdependency relations that are quite interesting. And it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of leadership to be able to do it. And so I believe that it is never really, in my view, a wise thing to believe one can shortcut through the use of extreme physical force in all of its manifestations to try to achieve this objective. And that we have seen time and time again where the more sophisticated, more capable interrogations, not in every case, but in many cases, have produced very useful results as well. The final point, in the United States, the people who advocate this, and there are a number, not Mr. Trump alone, consistently say, yes, it has produced results, but the classification system forbids us from telling you how or why. And my view, that's kind of hiding behind, put it this way, the shield of classification, particularly if they're past histories, and unlikely if, in fact, this system has really produced all those results to change the way in which people who are out there waiting to be caught are going to change their own behaviors. They're going to make them harder to reach. And in fact, obviously, I think it makes them more likely to join in the I won't use the word crusade because it has different connotations, but the jihad effort against us in ways that I think, in terms of the balance between liabilities and assets, puts us in a much more liable set of circumstances.
So Richard, look, the argument has been made that even if these interrogation techniques did not produce sort of tactical successes that people can't name because of classification, that is, disrupt a particular plot, that in the immediate post-9/11 era, they were used in a limited way to understand how this organization worked and to provide an understanding of who the enemy was. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree? Was it worth the cost?
It was not worth the cost. Absolutely not. And I mean, the situation in the UK is black and white. You know, there's no grey. Torture is illegal. And, you know, there were differences between, you know, the policy of my service based on issues of UK legality and CIA, for example. And these, you know, and then there were, let's say, contamination instances which affected my service. And, you know, the management of these subsequently was extremely, extremely difficult. And it's not a matter entirely being resolved even yet. So I'm a little bit reluctant to talk about it in detail. I mean, I think it's more important to occupy the moral high ground on these issues and to be absolutely clear where you stand. The problem is there are one or two examples where enhanced interrogation by the US authorities did really, you know, that we can mention one case, which is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which did, you know, give a lot of intelligence to the US. But I think even in those circumstances, the answer is no, you don't do it, because it is illegal according to the Convention on Human Rights and conventions on the use of torture. And the follow-on and the complexities legally afterwards, as we've seen here in the US, are just so damaging to the intelligence community. So I think that one has to have an absolutely clear-cut position. I mean, I can give one further example, which was the techniques that were used against the provisional IRA in Ireland before the law was changed in the UK. I don't know whether some of you remember internment and all of that. I mean, it frankly did not work. And in fact, it made the problem worse in many respects. And I think it's as a result of that experience in the UK, and our experience with terrorism because of the Irish problem goes back a long way. We had a painful and difficult passage, and therefore we emerged from that with very clear legal positions.
David, let me put the last, I'm going to go to audience Q&A, but I'd like to put the last question from me to you. Can you envision a circumstance now, post 9/11, with the tremendous experience that you talked about, where we would be willing to go back, given the pain that we've suffered sort of in the post enhanced interrogation techniques, Snowden surveillance? Can you imagine a circumstance where we would be willing to go back to those techniques as a result of a reaction to a terrorist attack in the United States?
Well, I think that one good thing about the revelations of the past 10 years or 15 years, and I think this is a self-interested argument for a free and vigorous press, is that I think even many in the intelligence community who were going along with all of this at the time because they were receiving instructions from above would be highly reluctant. And you heard John Brennan, the director of the CIA, say that he didn't believe that his own agency would go back, in part because of the legal liabilities for those who actually executed the program. They've been indicted in some countries, can't travel freely, and so I think it would be difficult to go back. There is the ticking time bomb example that Tom mentioned. If you want good examples of this, go download any old episode of 24, because they would run one at the end of every episode. They're not very frequent except on TV. And I think there's a way to go deal with that, which is to have one person, probably the president, maybe his president's designee, who could make a determination to allow that under those circumstances, under a highly documented procedure in which the person who authorized it would be subject to the legal liabilities, so that they've really got to go think about it. So I think it would be difficult to go back. I would agree with almost everything that we've heard here, but I just wanted to add on to and slightly disagree with Sir Richard on the Snowden revelations. First of all, the techniques that he revealed are now 3 to 5 years old. The revelations were 3 years ago, and some of the techniques had been used well before that. In the world of cyber, that's an enormous time period. So even if he had not revealed what he revealed, I suspect the technology probably would have moved on, at least for part of some of those techniques, since then. As recently as Monday, when someone, we suspect the Russians but don't know for sure, published the source code for some of the techniques that the NSA has used to get into systems, tells you that our problem goes beyond Snowden himself. Those were not the kind of, that source code was not in the Snowden documents, so they either had an insider or somebody made a mistake and put it on an outside computer system. But the bottom line about cyber technologies is, because they spread so quickly, keeping them secret, even if you don't have a Snowden-like figure, is far more difficult than traditional kinds of techniques and secrets. And I think in the end, while Snowden did enormous damage, just like you described, he also forced us to debate some things that did some good. You don't see the United States right now tapping into the cell phones of close allies as much. After we
As
hope
much.
as much, or let's say not all close allies.
Let me say, if you're stupid enough to discuss something on your cell phone that you don't want a foreign government to listen to, you
That's
just
right.
shouldn't
You're
do
not
it.
there, yeah.
You know,
One
and
day
I have
we're
no sympathy with Angela
One day we're
Merkel
going to
on
get
that
the
point.
transcripts, Sir Richard, of those discussions between Chancellor Merkel and her husband about
Exactly.
what to get for dinner, and you know.
You're going to really want to know the truth there.
Yeah, right. And the second point related to that is you saw the president 6 years in a row secretly reauthorize the bulk collection of telephone data. And then the year after it was revealed, suddenly come to the determination we didn't really need to go do bulk collection. They've now moved it back to the phone companies. And when I've asked the question, how has this impeded our intelligence collection since, the answer I've gotten almost universally has been not at all.
Right. Okay, so let's bring up the house lights. This is your chance to ask questions of the panel. We haven't gotten there. We could talk about cyber, which David alluded to, proliferation. We haven't gotten, there's lots on the table if you're interested. There are microphones walking down. If you raise your hand, I'll do my best to, please wait for a microphone to get to you, however. Questions? None.
Speechless.
They haven't had their coffee yet.
They're terrified.
Yeah.
Up right here, lady right here.
So you mentioned the lack of integration of different kinds of citizens in France and Belgium as a significant cause of or enabler of terrorism and such acts. And I'm wondering if you would expand on what that means for the U.S. as it moves forward.
Tom?
Wow.
Yeah. I think a British comment would be very useful here. But
No, and I'm not-
let me say, we talked about the racial divide yesterday. And I think we see what's happened in an election campaign where people clearly feeling the disadvantages of the economic and social situation in the United States have hit them hard, look at a candidate who perhaps is able to make more promises than reality would allow. And so are they likely candidates for something like this? We've seen in the past that they have been, maybe in very narrow circumstances. We've seen the Stockholm Syndrome where people who are not basically in economic and social circumstances in great difficulty can also be recruited. So recruitment is a problem, and the recruiters are even more of a problem, and one has to look at this as to the way things go. A strong, healthy society with a strong educational system, and I put a lot of emphasis on the latter, and I feel we have bobbled badly our national approach to education, particularly in primary and secondary, where most people are affected, is a vulnerability. It's a vulnerability in social terms. It's a national security vulnerability. Our ability to bring into the full panoply of America's offering people of color, we talked about yesterday, is a serious problem. It's a serious problem whether terrorism exists or not. And I would say terrorism is a minor portion of that at the present time. But it is a problem in national identity, national cohesion, national cooperation, and indeed what I would call the good health and enjoyment of life, which all of us expect and which we deserve and should be part of where we go. So I wouldn't overrate it. And I wouldn't advocate waterboarding and other spurious and, in my view, totally illegal cures for the problem. I would advocate the kinds of things that were discussed yesterday in changing the criminal justice system, the attitudes and the approach of people working on it. I would look at an educational system that not only brought people together, but helped them to stay together in their future. And I would look at a system that in which the economic rewards in the methods that we have to deal with them are more fairly distributed than they have been.
Sir or Richard, did you want to add?
No, the only thing I was going to add, I was going to pass the question to Tom because I thought it was being asked to me. So thanks for asking it. But as a non-American, I think one of the things I would say is that don't forget that this country has a phenomenal record of making US citizens out of its immigrants. It's the one thing that the United States is really, really good at.
Look at the space demonstration yesterday.
Yeah. So,
perfect.
And I think it's important to bear that in mind.
Other questions? Yes, sir, right up here.
I live a small portion of my life in France, and I think I'm relatively informed about French governmental processes. But as a result of the terrorist acts, I was astounded at the fact that there are these Muslim communities outside of Paris, Marseille, and Lyon that are pure Muslim communities that policing authorities don't even go into. Now, I'm sure there are private, police forces of people of some sort in there, but don't even go into it. And they sort of operate under Sharif law, and I'm just curious how it ever got to that magnitude and where it may be going in the future.
So Richard, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I served in France and was responsible for liaison with the French services for a long period of time, so I know the French security and intelligence establishment extremely well. There was an unpublicized but very important change that took place whilst Sarkozy was president of France. There were two French security organizations, one called the DST, which was essentially the French security service, and another peculiar organization called the Renseignements Généraux. And the Renseignements Généraux was a police service run by the government, and its role was to basically report on politicians and political movements to the government. And because Sarkozy had such a colorful private life, and he regarded the Renseignements Généraux as an intrusive and rather peculiar Napoleonic creation, he basically abolished it and joined it up with the French security service to create one big organization. Now, this was a big mistake. It wasn't a big mistake in terms of spying on French political parties, even legal ones. I mean, this could only happen in France. It was a mistake because the Renseignements Généraux were brilliant at street intelligence, and they ran sources into every mosque in France, and they had inside informants in all the mosques in France. That infrastructure largely disappeared when the RG joined up with the DST. And interestingly, in the current presidential election, one of the candidates, Juppé, who is the mayor of Bordeaux, who probably won't be the front runner, but I mean, he could be, and a lot of French hope he will be, has talked about restoring the Renseignements Généraux. And I think, in a way, it's indicative of trying to put those sort of street informants back into the system. Now, this wouldn't necessarily have solved the problem, but it would have probably made their coverage rather better, because the current head of the DST, a man called Patrick Calvat, has basically said, they lost a lot of that capability to cover their communities. And I mean, the French have never, in the past, been shy about spying on their own citizens, particularly those who are not ethnically French in origin. And, they don't have any reticence about it. So that would be partially my explanation. But there is a broader problem, which is, of course, the French state is aggressively laïque. It's a lay state, and excludes religion. And this has created a gulf, I think, between Muslims who do not necessarily make a distinction in their mind, but between their private beliefs and the government. Because in so many Muslim countries, there is not that division between church and state, where in France the division is absolute, and a lot of Muslim communities have just operated completely outside the capabilities of the French state. They have remained totally isolated.
So we're going to take one last question. Before we do, we'll get the mic to you. You're going to get to vote again. So let's bring up the question. Should enhanced interrogation techniques be permitted when dealing with suspected terrorists? 1 is yes, 2 is no, 3 is uncertain. You'll have 10 seconds on the clock to place your vote. Here we go. So while you're voting, why don't I take the next question?
How important is cooperation between technology companies and the government? And could you comment on Apple Computer and San Bernardino?
Fabulous. You know what? I'm going to give everybody a chance. I'm going to start with David, because David has spent a lot of time looking at the cyber issue. So why don't you take a crack?
So the core of the San Bernardino issue, this was the question that really crystallized for Americans the encryption issue. And the core encryption problem is this. If you are an investigator, or if you are the FBI or whatever, you don't want to have any part of the world such that you can't get in. So if there's an apartment building, you always want to be able to break down the door and go in and pull out stuff, presumably with a warrant. If there's a car, you always want to be able to get into the trunk, and so forth. So their view of the world is nothing should be off limits. That's terrific, except that there's a whole other part of the US government and a citizenry that doesn't view the world that way. Because the US government, for all the reasons we've been discussing up here, needs to encrypt its own communications, and because all of us have discovered that the iPhone in your pocket, the least interesting part of the device is the telephone. The most interesting part of it is that it's got all your photos, all your medical records, all your communications. So intercepting something on your cell phone is much more than just picking up a conversation that you're doing on your hard line at home. It gives investigators access to every element of your life. And if you're not encrypting that, you're crazy, okay? And so Apple has gone about encrypting it automatically, and that was the difference when they brought out a new operating system about 1.5 years ago. And there are parts of the government and a commission that President Obama created after the NSA disclosures that made the argument that the US government should come out and promote encryption across the board. And the FBI director then came out giving a speech taking the opposite position. It's not clear he had actually read the NSA report at the time, because he didn't take that issue up. And basically, the Obama administration has punted on this issue to the next president. What's interesting is that Donald Trump has come out very strongly saying that there should not be full encryption. And Secretary Clinton last fall also took issue with full encryption and has sort of gone silent on the issue since. But this is going to come back in a very big way.
You know, let me add one thing before I wrap up here, and that is to say, part of what you're not seeing in this debate is the recrimination for the revelations. There was some discussion about how bad was the revelations from Snowden. The tech companies, with whom having the privilege of being served but being out of government, I spoke to in the wake of this to understand the fight. They are very angry. They felt as though the government was coming in the front door with warrants and in the back door with the surveillance program. And so what you're seeing in terms of the encryption on the iPhone is they were angry, and that was not going to happen again, and they were going to make sure. They were going to literally prohibit a back door, so the government had to come in the front door, and they couldn't be misled. And so what you're seeing is a good deal of the result, the consequence of prior actions on the part of the government, and there's a grudge match going on here.
I have visited parts, there's a whole separate campus at Google that is devoted to defeating NSA efforts and foreign government efforts, the Chinese and others, to get into their systems. And that's because these companies have to sell abroad.
Can we bring up the results of the two polls as we're wrapping up here? Okay, so before is in the blue, and after is in the red, and it looks for sure that people were moved by the arguments up here that no, we shouldn't be using enhanced interrogation techniques when dealing with suspected terrorists. Can I ask you to thank the panelists? And thank you.
Even uncertainty did a little better.
That's it.